Good evening, welcome to Afrodo Reviews, and on this channel I bring you books to decide. Are they worth reading over second breakfast? Or do they deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? That's what we're here to decide. Today's book is Sherlock Holmes and the Adventures of the Sanguinary Court, or, more aptly, Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula. Now, this was written by Lauren D. Estelman and published on January 1st of 1979. It's considered book 4 in the Further Adventures of the Sherlock Holmes series, where Sherlock has done everything from fighting Dracula to tangling with Martians. And that's mostly because the Further Adventures of Sherlock Holmes seems to be a fancy way of stating that this is a series of crossover fanfictions published involving the titular detective. Honestly, it's kind of amusing going into this knowing I'm reading a 1980s fanfiction, but it becomes even better when you realize that in this connected series, Sherlock Holmes has been in War of the Worlds, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, teamed up with Harry Houdini to prove his innocence, and has fought not one, but 2 vampires. It honestly looks like a wild ride of a series, and I will definitely be returning to this someday in the future. But to continue on, due to the fact that this book is basically just published fanfiction, it doesn't have a lot of merits to its name when it comes to awards or commendations. Naturally speaking, we're just going to move on to the report card from here. This is about normally where I dive into the cover, but this is one of those exception books. Well, I argue that the cover of most books is pretty important. It's the first thing you see about this book, and it's responsible for bringing new readers in and getting them interested. You look at a cover and you decide, that might be interesting to me. So you pick it up and you read the synopsis. The old adage, don't judge a book by its cover, is true, but at the same time, a cover is there so you judge it. But this is one of those tales where you could probably have just put anything on the cover and you would have drawn attention to it. The title is literally Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula. It's going to draw you in if you have a interest in either side of that matchup. So that being said, we'll just go ahead and move on to the synopsis for the sake of context in this review. And the book more or less spells it out for you. This is a story about Sherlock Holmes meeting and matching wits with Count Dracula. This isn't a disconnected event from Bram Stoker's classical work. However, it's more of a parallel set of events that occur alongside it, with the beginning of the story actually having an author's note from Watson stating that Stoker was influenced by Van Helsing to leave his and Holmes' contributions to the defeat of Dracula out of the story completely. Honestly, my read of it in my TBR succinctly summarizes the story in a way that's going to give you enough context without actually spoiling anything. So if you're super interested in the context, please check out my TBR. But naturally, this also means that this review is going to be a little short, because apart from saying that this is a fun read, I don't have much to say on this book in general, to be completely honest. It wasn't bad enough for me to write 20 pages worth of critique picking apart the book, but it wasn't really good enough that I could sit here and gush for just as long. It literally is mid-tier fanfiction. I will give credit to Estelman in that he does do his best to lean into the framing device presented before him, as Watson is listed as the author. There's an author note from Watson in the beginning, and the entire thing is written like an old Holmes adventure. That is, it's published from Watson's point of view, from his old journals. I don't say that this book is a fan fiction in a way to disparage it, but mostly to add context. It's sort of the same way when you describe a book as young adult when you're warning someone about how it is. It's sort of what I mean when I say this is fanfic. The author takes liberties with the characters that don't completely sync up with canon actions. It's got this weird vibe to it as you read, as you know this isn't, canon adventures. This book even reads like they started writing it at first and didn't know how to end it. So if this whole thing just kind of has this middling feeling throughout it, like is this going the way I think it's going, or is it going a different way? Because I don't think the author has determined that himself either. For example, in terms of the characterization thing, contrary to what the adventure of the Sussex vampire establishes an actual Holmes adventure. For example, in this story, characterization. In this story, contrary to what has been established in the adventure of the Sussex vampire, which is an actual Holmes adventure, it's actually Watson who's the skeptic of the supernatural, whereas Holmes is the one who wholeheartedly embraces the idea that vampires and the supernatural are real. Now, obviously, this is happening because Estelman wants Holmes to maintain the intellectual superiority he has over Watson, as is the norm. But I think this is a case where the story could have benefited a little bit from role reversal, where Watson's superstitions have more merit in the scenario than Holmes' logic. This is somewhat notable only in that the book constantly references other Holmes adventures, such as The Study in Scarlet or The Sign of Four. But it then makes a blunder like that, which goes against the character's fundamental beliefs. Or something like I said, the story is overall just a bit average. Since it reads like fan fiction where the author didn't quite know where he was going when he started writing it. So, for the most part, the story just chooses to align itself with Stoker's version of the events. It comes off a bit like one of those sellout Tom and Jerry cartoons. You know the ones I'm talking about. Tom and Jerry and the Wizard of Oz, or Tom and Jerry and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Where instead of coming up with an interesting version of the story that interweaves characters that weren't originally present and thus giving us a new story, we just sort of have the famous characters more or less present in the background of the story doing their own thing, while the events of the other popular IP occur in the foreground. Occasionally they interact, but otherwise they don't affect the plot in any way that deviates from the main story of either side.
Don't just stand there, do something! Help! When he floats around to this side, Tom can dive in and save him. Help me! What do you mean you can't swim?
Now this is bad because of that, you are left with a sort of foregone conclusion throughout the majority of the book. You know that the book isn't going to break the canon of either story. So anytime Holmes and Watson face off with Dracula, you know everyone is going to walk away with maybe at best minor bruising. You'll know that when Dracula kidnaps Mary Watson, no great harm shall come to her because you need Mary Watson around for the other Holmes adventures she's present in after this one is set. And you know Holmes won't defeat Dracula because Watson in the beginning states that Helsing did do it. He just wanted to diminish the detective duo's part in the events. So this is honestly where I would have said if this was just fan fiction, it probably would have had an advantage. Because good fan fiction actually can take these chances and doesn't have to worry about the mainline canon if they really don't want to. So effectively, the problem with this book is ultimately that the concept of the crossover does all the heavy lifting in bringing you in and keeping you rooted, rather than the concept bringing you in and then the story presented keeps you rooted. Because of that, the story is a bit of a slog to get through, but other than that, it's an average toy. It's literally average with some fun bits. So because of that, in the end, as short as this review may have been, I'll be giving it a 6 out of 10. It wasn't a bad book in the slightest, but it was not as interesting as I was hoping it would be. I certainly wish for more variance in the already established canon of the two stories, rather than the forced status quo that the story was shackled to. The style of the book was a bit hard to read for me personally as well, but I won't hold that against the book because that's purely a subjective thing for me, and Estelman clearly used it to emulate original writing style. In the end, the book is more interesting on concept alone, whether it be a promise of what's inside or the fun idea of reading it, a 1980s fanfiction. But the actual story itself within the book is something that's hit or miss, I think. I didn't love or hate it, I just mostly found it a boring read. Though that does bring the question, does it deserve Mount Doom? Now, like I said, it was a fun read, and the novelty of it can carry you through enough of it that I think it makes it worth at least one read. While I would have liked something more, I think the book is fine enough as it is. Not great, but I could recommend this to a couple people who might be looking for something interesting to read. So overall, I don't think it deserves Mount Doom. With that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. See you later, everyone.